You've entered Night Terror's headquarters.
You never really know your neighbors. Not truly. At best, you wave from your porch, borrow sugar once or twice, maybe complain about a busted fence line or some loud music. At least that's how it was on my street. Quiet, suburban, not too close-knit, but friendly enough. That changed when the McCarthys sold their place. The new owner moved in late one Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I'd taken the day off work for a dentist appointment, and when I got back, there was a moving van in their driveway and a strange chill in the air odd for September. No one helped him unload. No family, no friends. Just a single man, thin and pale, maybe mid-40s, carrying boxes with a stiff, mechanical grace. I didn't get his name right away. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and gave him a casual wave. He stared at me for a long second, then nodded and went back inside. No smile, no wave. Just a nod, as if checking a box. His house, that is, the McCarthy's old place, was a mirror image of mine. Single story, brick front, small backyard, narrow side path that led to a wooden gate. Nothing fancy. But in the weeks after he moved in, something about it started to feel wrong. The porch light was never on, even at night. But a dim yellow glow always flickered from the windows, like candlelight, no matter the hour. And that side path? I'd catch movement there sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping past the gate or something low to the ground that ducked out of sight. Then came the noises. It started around the third week, a soft thudding at night. I assumed it was an animal, maybe raccoons, but it had rhythm, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, always after midnight. Always accompanied by the faintest dragging sound. At first I blamed the wind or my imagination, but it didn't stop. One night, I cracked open my bedroom window just a bit to listen. The air smelled like wet earth, rich and foul, and beneath the chirping of crickets, I heard it again. Thud, some dragging and a thud again. It was coming from the narrow space between our houses. I leaned out and peered down, and for a moment, I swear I saw a figure crouching low near the fence. Pale, almost hairless, hunched unnaturally. Then it turned and looked up at me. The eyes caught the moonlight, milky white, almost glowing. I jerked back and slammed the window. The sound stopped instantly. The next morning, I checked the side yard. There was nothing to see. No footprints, no disturbed soil, just damp grass and that old wooden gate leading to the backyard, now slightly ajar. I tried to reason it out that maybe it was a stray dog with mange, or maybe my brain had filled in the blanks. But the unease kept growing. And then my daughter Lily said something that really set me off. She was 6, bright and curious. One evening, as I was making dinner, she wandered in from the backyard holding one of her dolls upside down. "Daddy," she said, "the man in the dirt asked if I wanted to see his house." I stopped stirring the pasta. "What man?" "The one in the ground. He's funny. He doesn't wear shoes. He said we're neighbors under the fence." I rushed outside. The backyard looked normal, but near the fence that separated our yard from the neighbors, the soil looked off, too soft, too recently turned. That night, I couldn't sleep. I started doing research, asked around the neighborhood, but no one knew anything about the man next door. No job, no car, never went out. One neighbor mentioned he'd seen candles flickering through the basement windows at all hours. Another said he thought he saw him standing still in his yard at 3 a.m., just staring up at the sky. I considered calling the police. But what would I even say? My neighbor gives me a weird vibe and maybe has a mole man under his yard? No, I had to see for myself. 2 nights later, I waited until Lily was asleep and my wife was watching her true crime shows with headphones in. I slipped out the back, climbed over the fence, and crept along the neighbor's side yard. The earth was damp and cold. The only light came from a flickering basement window. I crouched down and looked through. What I saw raised the hair on my body. Something was crawling along the floor, limbs too long, knees and elbows bent the wrong way. The room was lined with shelves stacked with jars. Inside them, shapes floated in cloudy fluid. Small things, things with too many fingers. And in the center of the basement, a trap door. Not a normal one. This was carved directly into the concrete, ringed with symbols, circles, and crude faces with gaping mouths. The man knelt beside it, shirtless, chanting. His skin looked stretched, translucent in the candlelight. His mouth moved, but the sounds, clicking wet syllables, were like nothing I'd heard before. The trapdoor pulsed. I don't know how else to describe it, like it was breathing. And then he stopped. Slowly, his head turned. His eyes, those same white, gleaming eyes, locked with mine. The candle blew out. I fell backward into the grass, ran back over the fence, locked every door and window. That night, Lily sleepwalked for the first time in her life. I found her in the backyard, standing barefoot at the fence, whispering, "We're neighbors under the fence. We're neighbors under the fence." The next day, the house was empty. No trace of the man. The windows were boarded from inside. The front door had a padlock on it, rusted and ancient. I called the realtor who sold the McCarthy's home. She insisted it had been vacant for months, that the sale fell through, that the house never officially changed hands. I didn't argue, didn't press. We moved within the month. Even now, years later, Lily sometimes hums that same tune I heard the man chanting. Says she doesn't remember where she learned it. We don't talk about the house. We don't mention the soft dirt near the fence. And I never ask what she means when she says, in that strange little voice, "The man in the dirt still waves to me at night." I used to drive cross-country delivering vintage motorcycles for collectors, mostly to people with too much money and a strong need to show it. My routes took me through a lot of nothing. Old roads that hadn't seen construction since the 50s, gas stations with pumps older than me, and towns so small they didn't even have a sign on the way in. Last fall, I had a delivery scheduled to a remote property in New Hampshire. The client didn't want curbside service. He asked me to leave the bike in a barn behind an abandoned church on a hill called Dunmore. He said he'd pick it up himself after sunset. Sounded strange, but the money was up front and solid. I had never heard of Dunmore Hill before. The GPS didn't even show a road going there. The guy emailed me hand-drawn directions. I figured it was one of those eccentric rich people things. Rustic, off-grid, exclusive. When I reached the turnoff, I knew I'd been wrong. It wasn't exclusive. It was forgotten. The road to Dunmore Hill was narrow, cracked, and hugged by walls of pine so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. I drove slowly. Tree branches scraped against the truck as if they didn't want me to pass. It took almost an hour to reach the base of the hill. A small church stood alone at the top. Gray wood, arched windows, and a crooked steeple that looked ready to collapse. There was no parking lot, just a dirt path winding around the side. I followed it until I found the barn. It sat like a dead thing. The roof had caved in at one corner. Ivy grew through the boards like veins. But the doors were open, and the floor inside was mostly intact. Good enough for the bike. I unloaded carefully and wheeled it inside. As I was strapping it down, I noticed something scratched into the barn wall. Letters, faint but deliberate. It read, "Do not stay past third bell." I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I looked back at the church. There were no bells inside it anymore. The tower was empty. Or so I thought. After locking up the bike, I walked up the hill to look inside the church. Curiosity, mostly. The front door was unlocked. It creaked open with a sigh. The place was bare. Rows of pews, broken stained glass, and an altar covered in bird droppings. The air smelled like mildew and rot, but it was quiet. Too quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to stop the moment I stepped in. Then I saw the portraits. 6 old paintings hung on the far wall behind the altar. They were dark and cracked, but the faces were clear. Women with long dark hair, pale skin, and identical eyes. All of them stared directly forward. None of the paintings were labeled, and the women didn't smile. Something about them made my chest feel tight, like I had seen them before, even though I hadn't. That's when the bell rang. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded like metal, striking metal, but it echoed inside my skull more than through the air. I turned and hurried back to the truck. The sun had started to dip below the trees. I checked my watch. It was just after 5. Too early for it to be that dark. But the shadows were stretching fast. As I was climbing back into the driver's seat, I heard the second bell. It rang slower this time, a little off-pitch. I looked back at the church. No one was there. No wind. No birds. Just the empty tower and the last glow of sun dying behind it. Something in me said to go. Now, but the truck wouldn't start. The engine clicked once, then fell silent. I checked everything. Battery, fuses, even looked under the hood with my flashlight. Nothing was wrong. But it wouldn't turn over. Then I heard movement coming from the trees behind the barn. It sounded like footsteps. I locked the doors and sat completely still. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I looked toward the field beyond the church. They were standing in the tall grass. 6 women, dressed in faded gray gowns. Their hair hung straight and dark. Their skin was pale enough to glow in the dusk. Each one stood facing me, perfectly still. They didn't move. Didn't tilt their heads, just stood there like statues. Then the third bell rang. My breath caught. This time, I felt the sound behind my eyes, like pressure from the inside out. The women in the field tilted their heads all at once, and they began to walk toward the church. I didn't know what I was watching. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as they neared the front steps, something shifted. They didn't open the doors. They didn't need to. The doors creaked wide, slowly, like they were being pulled open from within. And the women entered. I tried the ignition one more time. Nothing. That's when I noticed the truck's side mirror facing the barn. There was someone standing inside it. Not one of the 6. This one was taller, with longer limbs. Its skin looked stretched too thin over the bones, almost translucent. Its eyes reflected the last bit of daylight, like mirrors. I turned slowly, hoping it was a trick of the light. But the barn was empty again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed locked in the truck with a tire iron in my lap, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating. Maybe too much stress or too little food. Maybe even carbon monoxide from the exhaust leak I'd been ignoring. But at some point around midnight, I heard chanting. It was faint but repetitive. Many voices in harmony. Then I saw the light. It came from the church windows, greenish and flickering, like fire underwater. Shadows danced behind the glass, twisting unnaturally. And then I heard footsteps again, coming toward me. I ducked low, barely breathing, and I saw them pass. 6 figures, cloaked in gray, drifting across the field. Behind them, something larger crawled, not walking, but rather slithering. A mass of bone and hair and long limbs folded the wrong way. Its face was a blur, but the sound it made was wet and sharp at the same time. They passed by without looking at the truck. I didn't move until the sky turned pink with morning. By sunrise, the truck started like nothing had happened. I didn't ask questions. I drove. I didn't even look in the mirrors, just drove without stopping. Weeks passed. I tried to forget, until I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a single sheet of paper. Written on it were 6 words. You heard the 3rd bell. I grew up in a small town in northern Minnesota, surrounded by thick forest, lingering mist, and lakes so wide and still they seemed to swallow sound whole. After college, I moved away. But 2 months ago, my cousin Eric called and told me our grandfather's old fishing cabin had finally been released from probate. He wanted to restore it and offered to split the inheritance if I came to help. The place hadn't been touched in more than 20 years. It sat right on the edge of Blackroot Lake, a few hours from the main road, and hidden behind dense pines that pressed in from all sides. We drove out in my truck with a trailer full of supplies: tools, canned food, portable heaters. The moment we left the highway, our phones dropped signal entirely. The deeper we drove, the more the road began to dissolve. Gravel became packed dirt. Then it turned into a set of ruts, barely wide enough for the tires. After an hour of weaving through trees, the cabin appeared. It looked like it had been holding its breath for decades. The porch sagged in the middle, the roof was patched with moss, and one window was cracked down the center. The front door tilted on its hinges like it no longer cared to stay closed, but it was still standing. And somehow, that felt like enough. We aired the place out and started sweeping dust from corners where spiders had built small kingdoms. The cabin had no power and no plumbing, but the view of the lake through the front window made it feel like a retreat. That night, we built a fire in the old stone ring and sat on lawn chairs drinking cheap beer. The lake barely rippled, and the air was so quiet we could hear the ice shifting beneath the surface. Just after midnight, I stepped out to take a leak near the trees and noticed something across the water. A faint light hovered just above the surface of the lake, glowing with a strange green hue that pulsed in and out like a slow heartbeat. It wasn't the beam of a flashlight or the flicker of a lantern. The glow had a strange, diffused quality, as if the water itself was breathing light. I stood watching it for a while, then turned back inside without mentioning it. The next morning, Eric asked if I had heard the whistling. I shook my head. He said it started around 3 a.m., a soft melody, slow and sad, like a lullaby from a music box. Probably just the wind echoing off the lake, I said. Eric didn't argue, but the look on his face told me he wasn't convinced. The following night, I heard it too. It woke me just before 3 a.m. I sat up slowly, listening. The sound was clear, gentle, human, and repetitive. 5 notes, played in a slow loop, over and over. It didn't sound like it was coming from the woods. It seemed to rise directly from the lake. Eric was already awake. He sat upright in bed across the room. "You hear it now?" he whispered. I nodded. "Don't open the door." He frowned. "Why not?" I didn't have an answer, just a tight feeling in my gut that screamed not to let that sound in. We lay there listening as the tune drifted around the cabin. The melody continued for several minutes before slowly fading into the wind. We didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found something on the shore. It was a long, pale piece of driftwood etched with strange symbols. Not letters, just looping, spiraling marks that curved in patterns I couldn't make sense of. The wood felt unnaturally smooth, and when I held it in my hands, I could swear I heard a faint humming like a vibration just beyond the edge of hearing. I dropped it back into the water and backed away. That night, the whistling returned. This time, it started before 2 a.m. The sound had moved closer. Eric walked over to the front window and raised his flashlight. "Don't," I said quickly. "Please." "Why?" he asked. "I don't know. Just don't." He hesitated, then turned the beam on. The light cut across the lake, illuminating mist and water. It swept slowly, then caught something moving just beneath the surface. A pale shape gliding silently across the water. Eric shut the light off and stepped back, face white. We closed the curtains and sat in silence. The whistling stopped. The next morning, Eric looked like hell. He said he hadn't slept, and he kept glancing toward the lake like something was going to crawl out of it. Around noon, he mentioned one of Grandpa's old stories, the one about Blackroot Lake having a mouth. "He used to say it sings to people when it's hungry," Eric said. I used to laugh when I heard that as a kid. I wasn't laughing now. That night, we heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, followed by a single knock. When we looked through the peephole, no one was there. Just the sound of water lapping against the shore. At 3:08 a.m., the whistling began again right outside the walls. It was louder now, circling the cabin. No footsteps, just that tune floating in the air like it belonged here. Then we heard a voice just beneath the melody. "Let me in." Soft, and it kept repeating, "Let me in." Eric whispered, "It knows we're listening." I covered my ears and started humming anything I could think of. The tune, the voice. They both vanished minutes later. At sunrise, we found wet footprints on the wooden floor just inside the door. Bare feet. We left that morning, packed everything before the light hit the lake, and didn't look back. As we reached the edge of the forest, I saw something etched into a nearby pine tree. The same swirling symbol from the driftwood. And it looked fresh. We never spoke about what we saw or heard. We sold the cabin to an out-of-state buyer and added a waiver clause about structural instability. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. But sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, when the house is completely still and the air feels too cold, I hear those 5 notes again. They don't come from outside. They come from inside my memory. And when I hear them, a shiver passes through my body.